So the first question that I want to ask you, we'll get started by: do you want to introduce yourself to the audience, like who you are, where they can find you on YouTube, and your role over the last few years, many years in the metal scene?
Okay, so I'm Samii and my pronouns are she, her, they, them. You can find me on social media at Samii underscore Arminto on Instagram and Samii Arminto without the underscore on TikTok. And I also have a Facebook page, which is the page that I go under when it comes to my gig promoting, which is Metal Wave Promotion. I started, I took over Metal Wave Promotion from my friend back in 2016. So I started under Metal Wave with my friend Phil. It was his, it was his baby initially, and yeah, I did a gig under Metal Wave Promotion in 2015 that was my first charity gig, and then I took it over in 2016. And I am a charity gig promoter that not only brings charities together but with the bands, but I also use small businesses, and I have small businesses set up stalls at my gigs too.
Before we get started today, before you go and click that dislike button, as I know so many of you are just itching to do, I want to state that at no point in this video am I going to call anyone a sexist or misogynist or whatever. I'm also not going to accuse metal music of being inherently sexist, and I'm certainly not going to imply that because you listen to metal music that you in any way endorse, are responsible for, or are supportive of any kind of sexism or misogyny. Today's video is about exploring ideas and learning new concepts. I should mention that, because of the title of this video, the video will be split threefold. We're going to learn about sexism and misogyny and how they thrive in cultures and subcultures. We're going to learn about metal music and some of its history. And we're going to learn about how the two intersect, plus some theories about why that happens. I'd also like to caveat that I'm going to be using the terms sexism and misogyny kinda interchangeably here, given the purpose of this video, but make no mistake, they are technically different things. Like, sexism is all-encompassing, whereas misogyny is sexism specifically directed against women. And for those of you wondering, misandry, no, not her, is the term used for sexism purely against men. And I'm sure it'll come as no surprise to find out that this video will not be exhaustive of everything to do with these concepts. I mean, metal music and sexism are two societal phenomena that some people have devoted their entire careers to studying. So if you like what you see, you can find all of the further reading I've collated right here. Although, reading does suck. Like, have you tried it? Ugh. Luckily for you guys, I've digested this stuff and made this video for you to educate yourselves with, so thank God for me, I guess? I'm so sorry, Jim Stephanie, please don't sue. And I know what you're all thinking. Metal's not sexist, it's just music. Why are you picking on my favourite genre? And the fact is, yeah, I kind of am. In some broad, abstracted sense, I could have gone anywhere, since, as we no doubt agree, sexism is everywhere in society. Or nowhere, am I right, fellow rationals? Oh, but I won't lie to you, I fucking love this community. I mean, I've been in metal for 7 years now. 7? I've performed all over England, I've performed in Wales, I've sound engineered for local shows, I've released 3 records, I've had local radio play. Metal music's my life, man. And you do tend to get more hurt by and criticise that which you care about when it fucks up. I'm sick and tired of seeing shit like this being spewed in the name of metal music. So that's why. We're a great community. What better way to honour the greatest musical creation of all time than by spearheading a revolution with it? Too much? Fine. Listen, point is, there's nothing wrong with calling people out on their bullshit. It's how we grow. And sometimes you have to take a look at yourself, do a little introspection, and check your words. If you've said or done anything sexist in the past, it's fine, mistakes can happen, believe me. I've said some shit in the past that I'm not proud of. What's important is that you look at what this kind of rhetoric does to people, what sexist attitudes can subject women to, and use your empathy to realise, hang on, maybe this isn't fair. I should stop doing that. As long as you learn, the colour of your soul remains completely clean. But now it's time to get down and dirty. It's time to think critically about our community. It's time to...
But Dad, I don't want to think critically. Thinking sucks.
Well, tough. Women deserve to be heard, so cut the attitude and listen up.
Oh, get out of my life.
I'll deal with him later. Now then, where were we? Ah yes, metal has a misogyny problem, and here's why.
What I want to ask, and pardon me if I overstep, we can stop at any time if it gets uncomfortable or anything, but what I want to ask is, did you ever experience what you'd consider to be a sexist attitude from someone you've worked with in the industry, and like what sort of behaviours would you say are the ones to watch for?
How do I word it? So the language and the terminology used towards myself when either booking a show through like a booking agent, or and if I do something alongside like a venue that normally has like another promoter or in-house promoter, sound techs, owners of venues, treat me either like I'm a fucking idiot, I don't know what I'm doing. They will try and take the piss in the sense of they will charge me more money, or they will just generally speak to me as if I'm shit. That's also happened within bands as well. Bands have actually spoken to me like I'm shit too. So it's more of what they say, how they say it, and rather than just kind of outright being like, you're a woman, you don't know what you're doing, it's more of a...
So what you'd say is more implicit. So like you can imagine that if you were a man doing this sort of business, they would probably be more candid with you, whereas because you're a woman, they've kind of already come to that conclusion in their head that like, she don't know what she's talking about, and therefore I will not be as candid because why should I, kind of a attitude.
Yeah.
When people typically talk about sexism, the meanings kind of become a little clouded. Listen, modern day discourse has this way of abstracting meaning from terms and reappropriating them for often meaningless ends. An example would be the word Marxist. It's used as a slur against anyone who disagrees with the likes of Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, any right-wing liar really, and it's used as a substitute for leftist or socialist, woke, you get the idea. But actually, Marxism as a term is incredibly complex. It's the ideology of Karl Marx, and Marx had a lot of ideas. His most famous ones were about labour, value, class systems, which don't particularly map very cleanly onto the modern definition of progressive identity politics, but it doesn't matter. Trumpers will just keep spouting that shit out like it's gospel. Sexism, as its broadest definition, is the ideology that encompasses beliefs that people of different sexes are inherently unequal, prompting different or unequal treatment from their peers. In the past, this has resulted in the societal disenfranchisement of women. They've been expected to be better carers, mothers and nurses, and seen as less suitable for strength, innovation or prestige, which is pretty disempowering for a number of reasons. And we're fair and balanced here. The sort of thing screws men over too. In the same way women are expected to be more caring and emotional, this expectation conversely insists that men are the opposite, and they're instead expected to repress their feelings and be cold and calculating innovators and warriors. And since society has expected men to be this way, they've been historically frowned upon when they don't hold down a good job and bring home the bacon, in the same way that women are frowned upon when they decide not to be mothers or struggle with childcare. The point of this section, however, is not to explain what sexism is, but rather what it does and how it spreads. Sexism can disempower both women and men in a lot of different ways. Like financially, women tend to end up worse off because the jobs that society expects women to do, like being a mother or a nurse or a secretary, tend to be lesser paid professions. Both men and women can get socially disempowered by sexist beliefs. For example, a man displaying emotion gets labelled as wimpy, or a woman who denounces having children receives condescension, and a promiscuous woman can get labelled slutty or a harlot for the same reasons that a man would get celebrated as a stud or a top shagger. And for general security and safety, our laws are hideously sexist in several places. For rape, a crime committed mostly by men, the conviction rate is horrendously low, and a victim's case could get dismissed simply on account of what she was wearing. And child custody battles tend grossly to favour the woman over the man, so yeah, we get it. The consequences of sexist beliefs governing our society are obviously bad. Biological determinism is the term that tends to underpin all justification behind these ideas, which basically states, well, none of it can be helped, it's just in our biology, which is obviously outdated as hell, but it continues to push itself into relevance. In the modern day, you need to look no further than Jordan Peterson. He famously cites biological differences as a reason expecting men and women to perform different roles in society as okay. And to be fair, he may have some semblance of a point, but to be balanced, this ain't good enough to justify rigid policies, laws, and expectations that breed all of these problems. True, on average, women on a biological level may be wired to be more nurturing, and yes, on average, men might be more biologically inclined to provide or protect. But use your brain. We don't live in the Stone Age anymore, where biological diversity may have gotten us killed or extinct before. Sure as shit won't now. Men have plenty of scope to be emotional and nurturing, and women are just as capable of providing. You've heard just now about what happens as a result of these beliefs. Financial disempowerment, social disenfranchisement, civil humiliation. It is downright harmful to believe that we should expect anything of anyone based on their sex. And using this as a justification for sexist ideas and as a way of downplaying their presence in society, it's disgusting. Stating it's biological is not only disingenuous of diversity, but also ignorant of all of the societal and environmental factors that reinforce these ideas. First, though, we got to deal with the discourse around sexism. The problem with how I see a lot of anti-sexists dealing with sexist attitudes is that, like the word Marxist, sexism is being used in kind of an unproductive way. What I mean by this is that it's being used dismissively as a reason not to listen to someone, like when the term Marxist is voiced by mainstream conservatives. Ian Danskin talks about this in the Alt-Right Playbook series. It's the discursive strategy of putting people in boxes. The Marxist box, the radical leftist box, the virtue signaler, the woke left. Not one of these terms actually has any substance behind it. They're labels that get given to you so that the person distributing the labels can ignore you because no one in those categories is worth listening to. And it's hella frustrating. You can be exceptionally well versed on a subject and with a swift flick of the discourse be completely ignored for something that isn't even accurate. Now, what I'm about to say is a false equivalency with this strategy, but I do think it's something worth talking about. Progressives do this too. Terms like bigot, sexist, racist, TERF are used dismissively, and for good reason. Normally, it would undermine the mental well-being and safety of women, people of colour and LGBTQ+ people to let any bigoted idea be taken seriously. And I'm certainly not going to insist that this stops happening. Like, that'd be easy for my privileged ass to say. But if we're going to get anyone to drop sexism, it may be more productive to meet them where they're at. Sexism, like all ideologies, isn't a monolith on its own. It's a collection of ideas. It's important to make this distinction because there is a fine line between someone who traffics in these ideas and a misguided individual who's picked up one or two by accident and winds up displaying them unwittingly. Which isn't hard to do. Ideas can come from anywhere. your school, books you read, your parents, your friends, the media, especially the media, as we'll find out later. We aren't born bigots, we learn to be them, which is why it's important to make the distinction between calling someone a sexist and simply challenging their ideas as sexist. The risk of conflating moral character with ideas serves only to push otherwise good-hearted individuals further into the arms of the overt sexists. And I will interrupt myself here to point out that I realise I'm essentially saying, turns out it is our job to educate the ignorant, which I understand is another really easy thing for my privileged ass to say, because I've not had to deal with any sexism yet, and where a comment to me might just be an intellectual exercise, to you it might be triggering or even dangerous, so by no means am I going to insist that we have to challenge these ideas. But you understand my point, right? It is much more productive to challenge an idea in good faith than to go immediately for a public shaming. Attacking someone's character may make them retreat, but where do you think they're retreating to? If it were just one or two isolated individuals, then yeah, this may work, but there are entire movements dedicated to peddling this shit. When someone's sense of moral worth gets injured because they discover they've been fostering a harmful idea, someone's got to break their fall, and it'd be much better for everyone if they were to fall into the arms of progressives rather than the sexists. The key mediating factor, I feel, is knowing who to engage and when progress is possible. And honestly, that's not something I can teach, I'm afraid. I think it's exhausting challenging everything and expecting a conversion. Like, you ain't getting the sexism out of Dr. Peterson, for example. But I almost think it's anti-progressive to do the opposite. A healthy balance is the key. And of course, there is no obligation to engage, because it is not my place as a white male to comment on or undermine the experiences of the oppressed. What I feel I can do, however, is offer some reassurance to those of you that have fallen for sexist ideas before. Definitely doesn't mean you're a bad person, because that's part of the grift. Usually these ideas are packaged in a way that doesn't offend your moral worth. It's like a spoonful of sugar that helps the poison go down. When Jordan Peterson tells you that expecting different things of men and women is okay because it's in our biology, you'd be forgiven for thinking that sounds like a rational argument, because how could we argue with biology? A lot of modern-day transphobia functions in a similar way. You'll hear a TERF go on about how we need to protect women and girls in female spaces, and you're like, yeah, protect women and girls, ban trans people from bathrooms. Oh, wait, the fact is though, we do live in a world of some pretty deceitful public figures. You know, Ben Shapiro, Stephen Crowder, Donald Trump, Stefan Molyneux, Steve Bannon, Nigel Farage, I could go on. And honestly, even a lot of high-profile left-wing YouTubers also claim to have started their political journey with some pretty problematic ideas. PhilosophyTube, Sean and Zandahal are but a few who mention that in their past weren't exactly very progressive. I mean, I myself have been pretty incel in the past. I've been anti-feminist, I've been casually sexist. We've all fell for some shitty ideas at some point. If they're cloaked in ways that complement our sense of moral worth, how would we know? It's like that moment in 13 Reasons Why, where Clay Jensen, despite being ostensibly the most morally aligned character on the show, isn't immune from slut-shaming Hannah.
I think you're just scared. I think you're waiting.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's better to wait.
Clay could have gotten that old cliche, it's better for women to wait until they have sex, from anywhere. Doesn't mean he's any less of a nice character, but I can guarantee that he'd have not responded well to being outright called a sexist for that. By the way, for the uninitiated, it's a sexist idea because, well, he ain't going up to Justin and saying, it's better to wait, Justin. Sex is a sacred rite of passage that isn't to be taken. And there are other ways ideology can be spread, which we'll talk about later. For now, though, to those of you that have fallen for sexist ideas before, it's not your fault. I've explained to you why sexism is a problem, and that any idea that propagates it is bad. And also that ideas are easy to pick up when you're least expecting them. But I can't stress enough the element of personal responsibility here. Like, I don't want you to use this video to absolve responsibility from yourself. I want you to take this knowledge that the video is here to provide and use it to catch yourself and those lying liars who lied to you before the sexism gets spread any further. And also, listen to people. Sometimes someone will find sexism in places you never thought you'd find it, in ideas that you'd never thought twice about. And when they do, don't double down. Learn. You'll be a lot happier the fewer prejudices you have. I know I am.
It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? Like when it comes to these sort of things happening, it makes me want to ask, like, what is it about metal? Like, it's thrown up all of this shit our way, but we're still here, aren't we? We're still here in the genre. So what I want to ask you now is what would you say your favourite aspects about metal are? What keeps you coming back?
The best bits are, do you know what? I have worked with probably some of the nicest people in the industry. I've worked with some of the best, most professional people. In my time when I wasn't putting on shows, I was going on tours, I was being a merch girl, so I was always part of the scene in some way. I've even gone to like band practices and just hung out and stuff like that. And I've gone to recording studios and watched bands record. I've been sent bands' first albums before anybody hears it, EPs, tracks. I've also released my own single with a band. So
excellent.
And my single is on an album, which, you know, is amazing. I performed on stage too at the O2 Academy 3 in Birmingham. It was fully packed. So I understand from pretty much every aspect of what a band does to create what they create. I get the studio bit and recording and writing and performing, and I see how much love goes into it and I see what they do. And some of the best bits, apart from some of what I've just listed, is the fact that I can help bands progress in their journey. I've got bands that, like band members that come to me for advice that is outside of music because they feel that comfortable with me to talk to me about a variation of things. I'm also the founder of Hallowfest. I am the only singular female promoter in the UK that raises money and awareness for male victims of domestic violence. And since launching it in 2016, I have had up to 30 to 40 men come forward to me, and I'm the first person they've ever told that they were a victim of domestic violence.
That's incredible. What I'm hearing is that, like, your favorite thing about metal is, like, there's this element of community. Like, everyone is just, like, in love with the music. Certainly hearing that you've had, like, so many men speak out about something that, you know, mainstream society would say there is, like, you know, this, you can't do that, like, men don't cry kind of a thing. The fact that they've said that to you, and the vehicle for that progression of them being able to talk about it is metal, sounds like that is the thing that keeps you coming back.
When I think about metal music, I'm sure it's completely uncontroversial of me to state that I see it as more than just music. It's the community that surrounds it, and when you delve right into it, stories of this community of metalheads are epic struggles of counterculture against, well, basically everything. The political class, sanctimonious parents, religious groups, other music genres. I mean, you name it, it probably lambasted metal at some point, which makes the longevity of the genre that much sweeter. You're probably all aware of its origin. Black fucking Sabbath. I mean, influence-wise, yes, metal comes from much further back, from the black-oriented blues music of segregated America, to the mixed-race fusion of country and blues to form rock and roll, to Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple accelerating it to hard rock with the help of solid body guitars and overdriven amplifiers. We arrive at Black fucking Sabbath. Birmingham, England, shitty post-war destitution, working-class musicians, and the associated, upwardly directed angst that follows all of it. Metal didn't start because it was the norm. It started as a challenge to the norm. It isn't just about the culture and community though, obviously. It's primarily about the music. Robert Walser, in his book Running with the Devil, describes metal as the genre that traffics in power. High-pitched, distorted vocals, loud, overdriven, overcompressed guitars, crazy and powerful drums, arrogant guitar solos, everything in metal is all about power, making a big, loud fucking noise, which is a transgression of norms in of itself. Music is more contained in classical and popular formats, but not metal. The louder, the more extreme, the better. The more people you piss off, the more successful you are. And this power, this energy that the genre produces is a sorely needed outlet for people who otherwise don't get any catharsis in their lives. A lot of the music metal produces is based around tense, unresolved verse riffs, building to a climactic chorus or a banging fucking breakdown that provokes a stress relief response as the musical tension resolves itself. And who do we think qualifies as the most stressed, the most in need of extreme catharsis in society? I mean, just look to the forefathers of the genre, the working class, and by extension all of the disenfranchised in society. It's obvious that in a position of privilege, things like economic concerns, social concerns, anxieties about prejudice and judgment are less troubling. If you've got the money, break as many eggs as you like, you just pay your way out of it. But at the bottom, there's a tension that underpins all life, a balancing act of trying to live whilst simultaneously trying not to become destitute, trying not to die. And it only gets worse the further down the societal hierarchy you go. The closer to the bottom you are, the more prejudices you'll find yourself exposed to, and the worse your mental health will get. Which is why I feel metal is the genre that speaks to the working class the best, because it's this sense of power, energy and release that it produces that scratches that itch the best. And you only have to look at what metal bands sing and scream about to confirm my theory. Metallica, Judas Priest, Avenged Sevenfold, Trivium, Arch Enemy, Machine Head, I could go on. All of these bands have spread the message of political anger, mental anguish, and a desire for release at least once in their careers. For some, it's their entire praxis. And speaking of challenging societal norms and trying to socially monopolise empowerment, metal culture is always about shattering societal expectation. It's why we dress in leather and studs. It's why we grow out our hair as men or shave our heads as women. It's why men on stage act flamboyant and women on stage act aggressive. It's why Cannibal Corpse provoke people with their music and artwork, because society tends to fetishize squeamish spectacles and avoid talk about death and murder, whilst simultaneously inviting people to watch executions and producing documentaries about violent crime. So George Corpse Grinder Fisher contextualizes his band as an entity that says, "Fetishize this, you filthy animals." Now, since I've described metal as the genre that's providing catharsis for the disenfranchised in society, I'm sure it's no surprise to find out that women, people of colour, and the LGBTQ+ community are also attracted to it, given the extraordinary amount of oppression those groups have experienced. And you may be thinking, yeah, well, not anymore, but laws may have changed, but attitudes and consequences take a little bit longer to be ironed out. I mean, for more information, just go check out my video on Black Lives Matter. To this day, the demographics I just described are still disenfranchised by society. I mean, maybe not quite in the same way or quite as much as they once were, but equality is definitely not the word for the situation. Lena Dawes, author of the book What Are You Doing Here, talks about the attraction that women and people of colour have to metal music and how it allows for a cathartic and politically satisfying release for these communities. She publishes the results of a survey at the end, in which my point is encapsulated perfectly by some of the responses to the question, what was it about these bands that attracted you in the first place?
I loved the bass and how the instruments blended together. It was like walking through a factory filled with rusty machines, and in a blink of an eye life gets into them and they start working. I'd never felt such an impact from a song before.
I was attracted by the sounds, the piercing wail of Robert Plant hovering over Bonham's thundering kick. Mick Jagger's peacock strut and his funky delivery made me want to kick some butt. The countless hours spent singing along with Janis Joplin taught me everything a woman needed to know about the journey of the heart. The imagery of the music coloured many sad hours of my often dark childhood.
It's loud, fast, and ridiculous.
I just loved the power of it. The first rock song that got me was Black Dog by Zeppelin. I was immediately hooked.
Whoa. Hold on a second. This video is about sexism in metal, right? So, you may ask, What the hell's all this? So much positivity about it from women. Where's the sexism? You're making it up, aren't you? And to that I say, no. I mean, metal is enjoyable as an outlet to deal with the stresses of working class life, but there's a little more to it than that. I mean, that book I just quoted, it's actually called What Are You Doing Here? A Black Woman's Life and Liberation in Heavy Metal. Those experiences we just heard are heavily broken up by myriad examples of overt sexism and racism from the metal community. And it's a story that keeps getting told, which means it ain't going away on its own, so guess we should have a look into it, right?
This is going to be a very open-ended question, but obviously, as you've explained, there are issues of misogyny and sexism in metal, certainly some that you've experienced yourself. What I want to ask is, like, as someone who has experienced them, what solutions do you think there are?
Well, first things first, I think saying like the men are the reason for men's problems and stuff like that, I don't think that's inherently true. First, parents, get your shit together and teach your kids. Like, come on. It all starts at home. However, a lot of us are either teens or adults, in some way young adults or in 30s or whatever. Call people out if they're being a prick. Men, certain men, not all men, certain men, they need to realise and kind of grasp the concept of there will always be women in this industry. There will also be, for everybody to remember, there will also be non-binary, trans, gender fluid people within the industry. There will also be anybody who is of any sexuality within the industry. And people shout the whole thing of community. Well, some people need to remember that and actually put that into action and not discriminate. I do think that if there are going to be any female promoters coming into the industry who watch this or who already are, know your worth. No, you don't deserve to be treated like shit. You can absolutely stand your ground 110%. It makes you feel safer. Get doormen, or have people at the show that you trust, that if shit kicks off, you can get those kind of people removed. Your girl has done it before, and I will do it again. I've even kicked men out of my own shows. It's a case of not putting up with that bullshit, and it doesn't matter what it is. I won't stand for homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, racism, any of it, sexism, the whole shebang. It will not be tolerated at my shows, and I will continue to make that message known. But I do think that in regards to a lot of it comes, the shit comes from men per se, in my experience. Just, if you see something going down, call your mates out. If it's one of your mates doing it, if it's not one of your mates, still call it out. On the whole, like, misogyny part, would you be okay if somebody treated your mum or sister that way?
This year, 2021, the UK band Fury released a track entitled Rock Lives in My Soul. And before we get serious, it is a banging fucking tune. Go listen to it. Fury themselves are a bunch of absolute legends. The song is literally about sexism in metal, and music aside, what really stands out about it is the video they released with it. Peppered around the live take and the obvious sing-off between male and female lead vocals, there are quotes from women in metal, and they're pretty staggering, as I'm sure you've seen. And the thing is, they're not new. This is a story that's been told for years. Women getting ignored, getting accused of being hypersexual, getting dismissed because they're not pretty enough, receiving essentially an entrance exam because men don't believe they're metal enough, getting accused of being too metal, oh, you're too aggressive, men not believing women can play their instruments, women being assaulted, being harassed, and not being taken seriously by engineers and promoters. It is disgusting, and it's everywhere. Arch Enemy lead vocalist Alyssa Glis-White has spoken out about sexism she's experienced. The all-female metal band Kitty have spoken out, and when I was perusing the landscape of this issue, I stumbled upon a Lockhorns panel discussion where 3 more women spoke about their experiences, and hang on, wait a minute, what's this? Right, now we need to have a chat. I know I've painted metal as an intersectional community of the societally oppressed, but clearly there's still a problem here. Before we get into why this juxtaposition exists, I need to talk to you about another way in which prejudicial ideology spreads. Unlike when you hear overt sexism, cloaked behind the spoonful of sugar or otherwise, the strategy I'm about to talk of enters your psyche without you even knowing. Something I'm going to label subliminal manipulation. Not sure if that's a recognised term or not, but if it isn't, it's mine now. It starts with the analytical model transitivity, which is a term used in discourse analysis to deconstruct sentences and phrases that tell a story. The ins and outs of it you don't really need to know for the purposes of this video. All you really need from it is that when you see or hear a sentence that's reported to you, say by newspaper or film or someone you meet, the way in which the message is presented to you can drastically affect the way you digest the information. Let me give you an example. The sentence we'll look at is, soldiers killed 3 insurgents yesterday. The goal of the sentence is obvious. It's telling us that soldiers killed 3 insurgents yesterday. However, as far as journalistic integrity is concerned, this could be reported another way. You might hear 3 insurgents were killed, which functionally still is kind of true because that is what happened, but you didn't hear about who did it or when. You could even abstract more information from there by saying 3 insurgents died, which now, while still technically being true, manipulates your understanding of the events even further because you don't know, they could have died of anything. And in the book Language and Power by Paul Simpson, Andrea Mayer and Simon Statham, this idea of deconstructing discourse is used to express how gender perceptions and sexist attitudes can be propagated completely under the radar. Using Kate Clark's work in studying how sexist norms are reinforced by infamous tabloid and Murdoch-owned right-wing propaganda rag, The Sun, they talk about ways in which stereotypes can be imparted to you without you even realising. One of the studied headlines from The Sun reads, "Girl 7 murdered while mum drank at the pub." And at first glance, you're outraged. If only that useless, careless mother had looked after her child, she would be dead now. And, okay, I'm not condoning this at all. Realistically, you shouldn't leave your 7-year-old daughter at home alone so you can go for a drink. But the framing of the headline is, I want to say interesting to sound academically switched on, but it's The Sun. Fuck The Sun. The focus is totally shifted onto the mother's actions, attacking her for displaying unmotherly characteristics, and again, fair enough, this is irresponsible, but there's no identification of the murderer at all. Consider the difference between girl murdered and man murders girl, which is what happened. Journalistically, the truth has been preserved somewhat, but the man doing wrong has been abstracted away, whereas the woman, who is only arguably partially to blame for it, is identified and condemned as if it were all her fault. And I say arguably because what if she were home? The man would have probably just murdered both of them, right? If the woman had stayed home and been killed with her child, do we honestly think that the headline, "Weak-ass woman fails to protect daughter while they're both murdered," would have been printed? Unlikely. The Sun jumped all over that opportunity to call a woman a bad mother, since society likes to push women to be caring mothers, but if she died with her child, there's no transgression of sexist ideals there. Although, I'll be honest, it wouldn't surprise me if the did decide to print a headline like that. And you might say, well, then the headline would have just been "Man murders mother and daughter." But to that I say, aha! Check out this next bit. Mark continues by saying the Sun, and media in general, has a tendency to separate horrific criminals from identifiers that tarnish sexist ideals using abstraction, which... that was a wordy sentence. Basically, particularly shitty men get labelled as fiends or other words that depict fantasised evil. When Joseph Fritzl, a man who infamously imprisoned his daughter for 24 years and fathered 7 children with her, was reported about in The Sun, they describe him as a dungeon beast and an incest monster, and yeah, he was, but the danger of abstracting his sex away is that it fails to prompt the question, how could we, as a society, produce such a monstrous man? Which is a question worth asking. Like I said, we're not born anything. We're born as babies and we're shaped by our environment. This description of Fritzl essentially says, well, yes, he was a man, but he's not like the rest of us. He's not a man, he's a monster, a fiend. Except, he was a man. This is what I alluded to in the previous section. It's incredibly likely that the Sun would have abstracted the murderer's sex away had they been forced to report about him without a female scapegoat. It's a form of abstraction that media outlets like the Sun use to hide characteristics that they don't want to be tarnished when someone with them commits a heinous crime. Don't believe me? Look no further than conversations about terrorism. When it's a jihadist terrorist, the discussion is always, oh well, Islam's to blame. But the second a white act of terror gets committed against a synagogue or a mosque, oh, he was a lone wolf, you know. He was disturbed. This was a terrible act. He's a piece of human shit. He's, you know. And then it transpires that the terrorist wrote a detailed manifesto of why he did what he did and cites a whole host of right-wing media outlets and figures, and they all go, what? That's no way. That's so strange. What a weird coincidence. The point behind all this is that sexist norms can be reinforced even when you're not realising it, when it's not direct. In the media, men will typically be referred to as their profession, such as fireman or accountant, or by action, such as the hero, whereas women are usually identified by their sex or by their appearance. A classic disparity between how women and men are identified occurs in the video game 7 Days to Die, well, the console version anyway, which has featured quite heavily on this channel. In the game, female zombies are referred to as woman, mother, girl, whereas the male zombies aren't referred to as male at all. They're labelled as carcass, walker, survivor, cadaver. This sort of thing serves to paint male as the norm and female as the deviation from the norm. Which is to say, we don't bother identifying a man as a man because it's just presumed that he is. It's only when the man isn't a man that we bother using gender as something we identify them with. This is something that Judith Butler talks about in her book Gender Trouble, though I must stress, in the example I've just cited, it's unlikely that 7 Days to Die does this on purpose. Like, the naming strategy is probably just a product of society rather than a conscious propagator of these norms. And I know what you're thinking. So, what's the harm? Why does it matter? And yes, the patterns of how we identify and talk about men and women seem benign at first, but what you don't realise is that your brain is being trained to think in a certain way. When your brain sees women being identified as women and men being identified as other things, you start to think of men as the default setting, because, as we've discussed, why would we define women as women if it weren't important to point that out, that they're a deviation from the norm of man? Keep this idea of men being the default in your mind. I'm sure it'll come up later. And when men are identified as their job, or women by their appearance, your brain might start to assume that these are the most important things about the sexes. Like, your first question to a man might be, what do you do for a living? Or when you meet a woman for the first time, you might instinctively say, oh, you look nice. And again, this seems benign at first, but consider the possibility that a man might want you to comment on his appearance and feels a bit disappointed when you don't. Or maybe a woman wants you to ask about what she does. I mean, she's really passionate about it and wants to talk about it, but you never ask. Even though it isn't explicitly sexist, when your brain digests information presented in this way, your perceptions of men and women are being twisted, bent in a certain direction that trains you to regurgitate these norms. You're being subliminally manipulated. So let's get into the problem of sexism in metal. It's no secret that metal has been a ferociously male-dominated genre for decades. I mean, women do feature, of course, but the overwhelming majority of musicians, engineers, producers, promoters, executives have been male. As for why this happens, there are a few theories out there. Robert Walser in Running with the Devil talks about the inherent masculine dominance of metal imagery. I mean, the very concept of power and freedom that metal traffics in tend to be associated with masculinity over femininity, but I'd argue that's more society's fault than metal. But then it goes on to talk about the removal of women from metal imagery in favour of homogenous male-to-male bonding, like being in a band, and goes on to quote John Fiske, stating,
"Feminine intimacy centres on the relationship itself and produces a dependence on the other that threatens masculine independence. Male bonding, on the other hand, allows an interpersonal dependency that is goal-centred, not relationship-centred, and thus serves the masculine performance instead of threatening it."
There's a lot to unpack with that quote, but what I extrapolated is that in the context of the views of a man in metal, a relationship with a woman is viewed as stifling, dare I say, nagging, whereas a relationship with another man serves only to bolster the freedom that metal is offering, which of course is nonsense. Like, not the theory, Walser's merely commenting on a pattern he studied in the behaviour of men in metal, but the fact that was there for him to study is pretty telling of why some men behave the way they do towards women. They're being subconsciously seen as a threat towards freedom, and by extension, a threat towards metal. And this is what subliminal manipulation does. The prevalent narrative that gets pushed onto us, the whole get a job, get married, have kids, that obviously isn't for everyone, has caused some men to panic. And they've displaced this perceived threat to their freedom onto women when it's just the bullshit narrative all along. And I've heard this too. Men saying shit like, women ruin everything, girls ain't worth it, they're the problem. And obviously, it isn't all men. Some men. Too many men. Walser's theories, plus the idea of subliminal manipulation, tell us a lot about male dominance in metal and where some of the sexism comes from. But in the book, I don't think he quite captures the full picture. Like, if the consequences of this are plentiful, I don't see any reason why the causes can't also be that. Let's quickly recap before we continue though. Biological determinism is the outdated theory that underpins all sexism, and sexism is bad because, well, we're just too diverse a species to think of people in such a binary fashion. The ideas of sexism can be spread by directly learning sexist ideas, even if they're cloaked, or by passive manipulation, causing us to think in sexist terms. This isn't everything though. For that, we need to dig deeper. Implicit bias, or unconscious bias, is a term that gets used a lot in progressive discourse. I've linked a couple of lectures below to explain what it is in further detail, but the TLDR is you're more likely to respond positively to that which you expect, and negatively to that which you don't. Let's do a thought experiment. We're pretty used to the idea that the sun will rise every day. It has done for every other day for the rest of our lives. Why wouldn't it rise? Now imagine that it didn't. Okay, ignore all the other environmental implications that it'd have for now. Just imagine it didn't rise, okay? You'd be terrified. Why hasn't the sun risen? Is my clock broken? What the hell is going on? I can barely see. You're not used to it, so it panics you. Now imagine that we lived in a universe where every other day the sun doesn't rise. Yeah, one day with sun, one day without. And it's been like that forever. In this case, you wouldn't blink twice when the sun doesn't rise because you're used to it. It's normal. Coming back to metal and how male-dominated it is, you can see where we're going with this, can't you? If all you've ever seen in a metal space are men, or at least if men make up the majority of who you've seen, anyone who doesn't look like them is gonna stick out like a sore thumb. And remember, we've already talked about how our brains can be subliminally manipulated into seeing men as the default. And there are studies that show the biological implications of seeing something, or indeed someone, that you don't expect. If you don't check out the others, I urge you to check out Valerie Alexander's lecture on unconscious bias, because she goes into this in more detail. But long story short, it ain't a good response. And it's one of the reasons that we harp on about representation so much in progressive discourse. The more women and other minorities that you see in these spaces, the more normal it becomes, and the less likely you are to react negatively to them. For a real-world example of just how much representation matters, have a look at the story of how Liverpool Football Club player Mohamed Salah's presence has reduced the amount of Islamophobic hate crime on Merseyside. This is something that, similarly to Walser's theory, explains some of the behaviour towards women in the metal community. A lot of the experiences of women described in Dawes' book, including in the foreword by Skin of Skunk Anansi, are generally based off of the surprise of merely seeing women, particularly women of colour, at a metal show. I mean, the book is literally called What Are You Doing Here? And these resolve in varying negative consequences that range from a simple passing look or comment to full-blown hostility and even physical violence. You see, this is what happens when you dig deep into something like this. It gets very bleak, and I didn't even live through these experiences. I can only imagine what women must feel when things like this happen. But I'm not here to call you a victim. I'm here to platform you, to empathise and work towards a solution. And in order to make good on that last part, I've got one more idea to discuss. In 2017, YouTuber Sean posted an acclaimed video entitled Fate of the Frogmen, and in it he explains the, I guess, historical event, Gamergate, which basically was where a bunch of white men got offended that a feminist video game critic dared to mention that video games might be a little misogynistic in places. Also in the video, Sean talks about something that I think maps quite well onto the issue of sexism in metal, and might help us begin to work towards fixing the problem. And that, of course, is where the capital G gamers found a shared identity. Sean explains that, in the modern climate, there aren't really a great deal of easily identifiable features that white men can use to create a sense of community. For all of the oppression that women, people of colour, LGBTQ+ people have experienced, and it is a lot, don't get me wrong, the one thing they can share in is this obvious sense of communal identity, which in a lot of cases has become a movement to try and bridge the gap of inequality. Women have feminism, people of colour have Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ+ people have Pride. White men, though, well, the only easy identity they can share in is the identity of the oppressors in these stories, which I guess kinda sucks. And I'm speaking primarily about working class white men here when I say it must feel pretty crap whilst being told you have white privilege, straight privilege, male privilege, cis privilege, to feel like shit because you can scarcely afford to pay the bills. Like, economic oppression is still crap, and don't get me wrong, white, straight, male, cis privilege does exist. But when you feel like shit, and it seems in poor taste to rally behind more obvious parts of your identity, such as race and gender, it's not surprising to me that A, you'd start to enviously resent people of those aforementioned communities, especially when you feel isolated and people like Sargon and Thunderfoot are trying to stoke the fires of resentment with their bullshit, and B, that you'd try to displace your identity onto something else, like video gaming, or your shared inability to find a partner, or metal music. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not making excuses for white working class men here. Fact of the matter is, whatever hardships you feel you've gone through, I guarantee you that women, people of colour, and LGBTQ plus people have it much harder. I mean, we're all economically oppressed and feel like shit. Most of us didn't become bigots. But I also do think that we don't talk about the plight of white working class men enough, because just as we can be subliminally manipulated into thinking in sexist ways, so too can we be subliminally manipulated into thinking that capitalism is unquestionable. And make no mistake, the source of all that economic oppression that fucks with the mental health of white working class men, hell, people of all identities, is capitalism. The reason you can't afford luxuries and struggle to pay for food, the reason you work in excess of 40 hours a week for a minimal payoff, is because of the greedy reptiles at the top, leeching your life force to sit on wealth they don't need and won't use. And I want to talk to the white men watching this video now, particularly the young white boys who might be feeling a bit anxious, confused, angry at the world. And I want to say to you, I understand how you feel. And I don't want you to think that I'm patronising you by telling you you're economically oppressed and struggling for an identity. In fact, the only reason that I feel able to talk about this at all is because you're me. I know how shit you feel because I was like you when I was younger. I mean, I've already mentioned that I've been incel, anti-feminist, and sexist in the past. I know what it's like. You enter political conversation for the first time, which with social media has never been easier to do, and the first thing you notice when you look at debates between the right and the left are that you've been cast as the villain in a game you've never even played. And it is so easy to just look to people who tell you feminists are stupid, you're better than them, they're just jealous, you're rational, Black Lives Matter are just rioters, the gays just want attention. And when you're told this, it becomes a vicious circle because you enter a treasure trove of dismissal and you're never exposed to reasons why these movements are necessary, and you're never exposed to why you feel so shit. And it isn't just capitalism tightening the screw. Remember earlier when I mentioned that sexist ideas can affect men too? Well, how the hell are you supposed to express all of this anguish when society tells you men don't cry, that you need to man up and get out and earn more? I mean, fucking Christ, it's no wonder the male suicide rate's so high. And I know that at first when women, people of colour, or LGBTQ plus people point out that they've been unfairly treated at a metal show, online or a metal forum, or anywhere else in the community, that it can feel like an attack. Because for a lot of us, including me, metal's been a source of pride. A bit of a safe space too. Like, hands up those of you who were bullied at school, be it for your music taste itself, or maybe your height, lack of obvious masculinity. In my experience, I got bullied. I wanted to play football, they never let me. I wanted to be my nerdy self, and I got chastised for it. The time I felt the safest was when I found metal. There was a group of about 20 of us who loved metal music, and honestly, I'd never felt more secure than when I was there. So when someone points out that there are problems with just about the only space you've ever felt normal in, it is so easy to just try and silence the problem rather than work towards a solution. To maintain the illusion that your chosen rallying point of identity doesn't risk making you look like a bad person. But please, listen to me. You spent so long wondering where you fit in, having to defend yourself from hatred and dismissal, and you finally found a place to rest your head. In the community of the disenfranchised. These people experiencing sexism, homophobia, transphobia, racism in metal aren't here to interlope and tear down your home. They're here because they love the music, just like you. They're not here to tell you metal is full of bigots. They're here to enjoy themselves, just like you. They're not here to take your favourite music away. They're here because they're angry at the world and need an outlet. Just like you. Trust me, your fight isn't with these people. It's with the people making them feel like shit. When all they want is a safe community. Just like you. So stand down, soldier. At ease. As I've mentioned, metal is a genre not just signified by its power, but also by the fact that it has knocked back critique from every direction. And that's something I think permeates through. Like, everyone here has had its shit, and for different reasons, we're all outcasts, just like the genre itself. What we share is our love for the music, our love for the power and release it lets us feel when life has gone out of its way to deny us those things. You wanted an identity? You have it here. We're metalheads, all of us, every man, every woman, whether you're black, white, gay, straight, bi, trans, non-binary, cis, and we all deserve a break, right? Society shunned us, we found a way to say fuck you. But unfortunately, as I've already explained, ideas, specifically sexist ones today, are extremely pervasive. They're woven tightly into our discourse, our knowledge, our very way of life. And sometimes our metal brethren stumble on their trek through the swamp and get a little idea in their heads, like the spore of a fungus, which, if left unchecked, can grow and spread. And our metal sisters don't deserve that. No one deserves to be made to feel like shit for something as immutable as their sex or gender. You can drop an idea on a dime, but asking someone to change who they are, it's just not on the table. And after all the shit our metal sisters have undoubtedly been through in their lives, we owe it to them to stand with them and to challenge the sexist ideas that get spread around. We're all here to enjoy the music, free from the prejudices of normal society. So let's keep this space sexism free, yeah? I know it's a problem. It's a problem we can solve. Whew, that was an intense ride, wasn't it? I want to say thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate it, especially if any of those trigger warnings apply to you. You are awesome. I want to conclude this video by saying that it's not all doom and gloom over here. As bad as I've made it look, and for good reason, I was pleasantly surprised when collating research for this essay to find out that actually, in recent studies, metal seems to be becoming less sexist. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is still a problem. Fury didn't just fabricate those comments, but the studies show, whilst you can still reliably find sexism in metal, it also shows that metal, on the whole, is less sexist than mainstream society. Like, women still do describe experiences of sexism in metal, but they also say that, well, compared to outside of metal spaces, metal's actually quite a safe place to be. A lot of people, particularly men, do tend to come rushing to their aid when something particularly heinous happens, and whilst I don't want you to think that means there's no problem here, it is quite uplifting, isn't it? The bottom line is this. Metal, in its infinite glory, is, I believe, a great place for us to spearhead the monumental task of addressing the inequalities in society. Local grassroots shows, crowd-funded music projects, intersectional community, and a constant attitude of challenging the mainstream make metal a bastion of kicking bigotry out. And I think that's something to be real fucking proud of, don't you? So go, be free, enjoy the fucking music, but keep a close ear out. You've learnt some ideas today that hopefully will furnish you with the tools needed to challenge when sexism rears its ugly head. And whilst I don't feel that we'll ever completely eradicate sexism, like a bottle of antibacterial spray, we can certainly remove 99.9% of it. And the remaining 0.1% will be so insignificant, it'll barely make a dent. Thank you all for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next video. Whatever it is, I'll be there. Take care. When Jordan Peterson tells you that, oh God, Peterson, it's his name now, Dr. Peterson, that a feminist video game critic dared mention that video games might be a little misogynistic in places. Unlike what I just did, 7 days to... Shit, I've just done a Sarkeesian, haven't I? And in the book Language and Power by Paul Simpson, Andrea Mayer and Simon Statham, that I was really like, Paul Simpson, you sound saucy, right? Too much? Yeah, it's stuck on my fucking head, that's why it's too much. Bunny's drinking. How am I supposed to record audio